It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 55. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. And this is the podcast dedicated to professional wrestling history from 1870 to 1920. And sometimes we'll get up even as late into the 30s. This week's episode is going to be a bit of a crossover because I'm going to talk about some MMA to wrestling crossover both this week and in our next episode where the gang will be all back together. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenge matches in Brazil and the working of matches and how even today in modern day MMA that you have to be concerned about the possibility of matches being worked or bouts being worked because of the sports betting. It's very lucrative, and gambling schemes are one of the causes for wrestling being worked prior to the promotional system being developed. Once the promotional system is developed in the late teens and 1920s, the promoters are going to want to control things, and it's going to be a work from that time on. But even in the earliest years of professional wrestling in the United States, matches were worked, and usually they were worked because of gambling schemes. Don't hear what I'm not saying. Not all of the matches were worked. The majority of matches, I would say, most of the matches in the 19th century were competitions, legitimate contests, although they did have some worked matches during that time. 1900 to 1915 is really sort of a transitional period. I'd say that earlier on more matches are contests. The closer you get to 1915, the more likely it is that they're working. And after 1915, there are a few legitimate contests, but the majority of legitimate contests after 1915, almost all of them, in fact. There's a handful of people still shooting in the late teens, early 20s, but for the most part, you only have legitimate contests as a shoot to settle a promotional war. So a John the Nebraska Tiger Man Pesek versus Marin Plastina in the early 1921. John Pesek versus Nat Pendleton in January 1923. Or double crosses like Stanislaus Zbyszko versus Big Wayne Munn in April of 1925. Those are really the only legitimate contests you're getting into. But prior to the time of the promotional system and that 1915 time period, a lot of the wrestlers worked matches as part of gambling schemes to bet on their matches and maximize their gambling wins. And we just had the UFC card. I'm recording this on Sunday, May 12th, and we just had I think it's the first UFC event from St. Louis yesterday on May 11th. It might not be the first, but I think it's the first UFC event. It's not the first MMA card, because Strikeforce had some cards here, and we've had a couple local promotions. But I don't think I'm speaking out of school when I say I think it is the first UFC event we've had in St. Louis. If I'm wrong, somebody will correct me, I'm sure. And before I get into this month's history topic and how it's going to relate to other things, I just wanted to give a brief update. The Pesek book is going well. I still anticipate that being a summer release. And I owe two people emails. So Will and Shannon, I had emails from both of you guys over the past month. And I owe you both a response. But I'm hoping to get that out this week. But Shannon asked a really good question about, was I surprised by the release of Gable Stevenson? And I was, because that was a huge signing. But it was the thing I was worried about from the beginning when Endeavor took over World Wrestling Entertainment. I don't think it's going to affect the product that you see in the WWE ring. Well, it could. I should probably backtrack on that a little bit because I think it has negatively affected the UFC. It's one of the reasons I started to fall out of love with the UFC a little bit, is because they cut a lot of known fighters that have built a following to push younger fighters who win, like on Dana White's Contender Series, and they cost less money to put in the ring. And that's one of my issues with Endeavor. On one hand, I get it, they're a business and they are trying to make sure that they're as profitable as possible. However, you can't put on an inferior product, and I think it has affected the UFC's product over the last year. Sometimes injuries don't help, but I think that they have cut a lot of people that the fans cared about, and they've tried to replace them with younger talent by putting them on Dana White's Contender Series. But I'll be honest, I'm a big UFC fan. I don't even watch that show. I figure if they're that good, they'll get on a UFC card and they'll show how good they are. I think that they're still thinking it's Ultimate Fighter. A lot of those Ultimate Fighter seasons built big stars in the UFC. I don't think people are watching Dana White's. And if you have the Ultimate Fighter on, I don't think people are going to watch it like they used to. I can't remember the last season I've watched because it was so played out. You know, they got to season 12 or season 13 and I kind of lost interest. And I would be considered a hardcore fan. So the casual fans, I can almost assure you, are not watching that. I think you could have the same thing going on in WWE. I think that Endeavor could cut some higher priced talent and try to replace them with some of the younger talent. That's not always a bad thing. I think that pushing Braun Breaker is a great idea. But I don't think it's a good idea to cut people that have been around for a long time, and particularly in wrestling. Wrestling's not like MMA. MMA is a legitimate contest. Wrestling is a work. It's an exhibition. And you need experienced wrestlers to help lead the younger talent through these matches. And so I am worried about Endeavor being a little cut happy to try to increase their bottom line. Whenever the accountants and the lawyers take over, it generally has a tendency to negatively affect your product, where it may improve your bottom line, but it negatively affects your product a lot of times. With all that being said, I've never seen footage of Gable Stevenson, so maybe he could never get used to the work nature of pro wrestling. Quite honestly, I'm kind of surprised that he didn't go into MMA, because with his wrestling background, and maybe he doesn't like getting punched in the face. That's the hardest thing for a lot of the amateur wrestlers to get used to. But if Gable Stevenson could get used to the other elements you have to learn to be successful in MMA, he would probably have an outstanding MMA career in front of him. And that's why so many of these NCAA wrestling champions and Olympic wrestling champions have been going into MMA after their amateur wrestling career is over, because they can translate those legitimate skills into some really impressive MMA careers, and MMA pays very well too. For whatever reason, Gable Stevenson decided he would rather do pro wrestling, and he could have been a Kurt Angle, but there was obviously, they either thought he wasn't getting something, he couldn't adjust to the work nature of it, and with a guy like him, if he can't adjust to the work nature, people could get hurt. You know, he's a fired up guy and he's so strong, and he could put anybody on their back that he wants to. If somebody doesn't take that fall right, he could end up planting them right on their head. So I'm not sure. I can't say that this was purely a cost-cutting move and that it's something they're going to regret, because maybe he couldn't get the worked nature of pro wrestling. If he's still interested in trying to parlay an MMA career, I'm sure that a lot of the top gyms will be chomping at the bit to try to get him in and give him an opportunity. And one of the things that Shannon had pointed out was he did not go to the Olympic trials this year, and somebody that he had dominated in the past won. And he probably didn't go to the Olympic trials because of his WWE commitments. The timing is pretty bad. So I'm really hoping that it's a case of him not getting it, not a case of we paid this guy a lot and we don't think we're going to see the fulfillment of that potential for 5 or more years, so we're just going to cut him and move on. I hope that's not the case, because they could have done that with Mark Henry. And if you would have had Endeavor, you probably would have had that happen to Mark Henry, because he said himself it took him a while to get pro wrestling, and it was only working with Jim Cornette and Ohio Valley Wrestling that really helped him to make that adjustment. But he struggled to get it at first, and the WWE had made a 10-year investment in him. I think under Endeavor he'd have been cut already, but Vince was patient, and his patience eventually paid off. I don't want to be patting Vince on the back too hard, because I've got plenty of issues with him over all of his other bad conduct. But Vince did care in the early years, pre-2001, 2002. He did care about the product he was putting in the ring. He was never trying to put on the best wrestling show, but he always was trying to put on the best spectacle. So I hope that this is not what I fear it could be, and I'm still concerned about Endeavor's management of WWE. They made the right decisions creatively. Putting Paul Triple H Levesque in charge of creative was brilliant, and they should pretty much leave him alone and let him do what he's doing, because he's shown that he has good instincts for it, and you could tell he was a pro wrestling fan when he was a kid, because he's doing more wrestling things than Vince ever would have allowed. So they're making great decisions creatively. I'm not so sure about the making everything financially based, but time will tell. So on with the show, and let's jump into the main content. Oh, I forgot to, I said we're going to have the band back together. So for our next episode, which will come out on May 27th, Labor Day, you will have all 4 of us together, and we're going to talk about challenge matches, pro wrestling, BJJ in Brazil. A lot of this information comes from the 2 books, Choke Volume 1 and 2, and some of Robert Drysdale's research. But that's talking about the challenge matches in Brazil that involved a lot of pro wrestlers, judo black belts, and jiu-jitsu black belts, and working outside of the United States. But this week's topic I wanted to talk about is a match between Jim Browning and Taro Miyake from 1924 in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, to set this match up properly, Jim Browning at the time was a 21-year-old up-and-coming wrestler, and he had just left Missouri because he was from Verona, Missouri, and he was wrestling in Missouri and Kansas during the early part of his career. But he had just moved to Tennessee, where he would start to build a national reputation. And that national reputation would really be developed when he went to Boston and started wrestling for Paul Bowser. And I've been interested in Browning for 2 reasons. Number one, during the double crosses of the 1930s, after Toots Mondt had double crossed Jim Londas for the heavyweight championship, he put the belt on Jim Browning. Well, in that era, if you put the belt on a wrestler, you believe that wrestler could hold their own and not get the belt taken off them legitimately. So Browning had to be a very skilled shooter and hooker for them to put the belt on him during that time. And Browning also died very young. He caught it wasn't pneumonia, but he caught a viral disease, and in his mid-30s it proved fatal. And that was very unusual as well for someone who to be in that kind of condition, to die from a viral illness that at first they didn't think was very significant at all. But he continued wrestling with it, and it continued to get worse, and by the time that he finally sought medical attention, it was too far advanced for them to do anything about. And this is in the mid-1930s, so there's not the medical advancements that they have today, but it was much more advanced than at the turn of the century. At this point in their careers, Miyake, who had wrestled many legitimate challenge matches when he first came from Japan, and he was wrestling in both England and the United States. Initially, the jiu-jitsu and judo black belts who came to the United States wrestled challenge matches to try to stimulate interest in people to take up whatever style of martial art they were teaching. A lot of it was judo black belts, but Taro Miyake is actually a jiu-jitsu black belt, and I believe he studied the same style of jiu-jitsu that Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo, studied before Kano founded judo. So Jigoro Kano's, anybody in modern Japan knows that name. He founded a style of, at the time it was considered a style of jiu-jitsu, but now it's just a style of grappling. Judo is something distinctive from jiu-jitsu. And Kano, a number of his black belts went out as well to spread that art, and they took part in challenge matches too. So like Mitsu Maeda, Count Combat, the person who taught the Gracies, or at least taught the people who taught the Gracies. And you had several other judo players that did that as well. But Miyake was a jiu-jitsu black belt who was spreading his style just like the judo black belts were by taking part in challenge matches. And he took part in a very famous challenge match when he was in his mid-30s with Ad Santel in San Francisco. It was a mixed styles match, so they were wearing jackets. In fact, it was on the same format that the match that Miyake's going to have with Browning is. The difference was Santel and Miyake were shooting in 1916 in San Francisco. In 1924, he and Browning were not shooting. But he wrestles Ad Santel, and for years all I heard was Ad Santel grabbed him, slammed him in 30 seconds, and pinned him. Which is true, but that was, he pinned him at 30 seconds of the second fall. They had actually wrestled 30 minutes in the first fall, and Miyake won that first fall by throwing Santel. And that's some of the things that you will find when you start researching is, yeah, there's some truth to the story, but there's often things that are left out, or certain things are emphasized to build the reputation of the wrestler, and you really got to dig to find out what really happened. In 1924, Miyake has adapted, he's in his mid-40s, and he's adapted to the work nature of professional wrestling. He works his matches. And one thing I forgot to say, because this, in our next episode when we talk about this in Brazil, the same situation existed in Brazil. A lot of the judo players and jiu-jitsu players who came from Japan could not make enough money teaching martial arts exclusively to support themselves. So their challenge matches, besides being a way to spread their art and help to make their schools more commercially viable, where they could earn a living, were also to supplement their income and help them keep a roof over their head, be able to eat, etc. And that was the case for Miyake when he went to England and was working with Yuki Tani, and when he came to the United States, he often took part in challenge matches to also supplement his own income. He eventually, because he started getting older, he was approached by promoters who wanted him to work matches. And like a lot of the people we're going to talk about in the next episode, he agreed to do so because he needed the money, and he could make a lot more money without the possibility of being hurt if he was working with his opponents. So he starts working matches in the teens and the 20s and all the way up into the early 30s when he's in his early 50s. He is working matches in professional wrestling, but a lot of times the promoters would play off his reputation by having him take part in these challenge matches. And that's what this match in Tennessee was. He was wrestling a mixed styles match with Jim Browning. And what the mixed styles match consisted of is they would wrestle the first fall in gi tops, and it would be more judo, jiu-jitsu style rules. And then the second fall would be in catch wrestling with no gi tops, etc. And as would be expected, Miyake wins the first fall with Browning in about 9 minutes with a cross choke using the gi. They have the usual 10-15 minute intermission, easy for me to say. And they come back and they have the catch-as-catch-can bout. And that goes a little while, and everything is going fine. They're exchanging holds and everything. But about 20 minutes into the match, Browning and Miyake have a particularly rough exchange, and Browning shoves Miyake back. Miyake protests, "What are you doing?" and Browning punches him. Now, in the 1920s, if you punched somebody in a wrestling match, you were normally disqualified. The promoter, however, had booked this thing for Browning to win the match, and the referee knew that, so the referee gave Browning a hard warning. And the referee actually stopped the match for about a minute to try to calm both men down. They calmed down a little bit near the 40-minute mark, which was when Browning was supposed to win the second fall. He puts a head scissors on Miyake. Now, a head scissors or a body scissors, particularly around the head, because you can get the legs around the neck and squeeze and do a choke. That's a BJJ self-defense against a headlock. But he actually has it around Miyake's head, and he squeezes Miyake's head so hard that Miyake's ear starts bleeding. And Miyake is disoriented. You know, anytime something injures the ear, you're kind of disoriented in that, and he can barely stand up. So they help him to the corner. The ringside physician examines him and says, "You cannot continue," and they go ahead and the referee awards the match to Browning on the third fall and the match to Browning on a forfeit because Miyake cannot continue. Fans, of course, are none the wiser, but that obviously was not how the match had been booked out to end. And I know a lot of modern fans would say, "Oh, Browning got mad and shot with him." No, they quit cooperating with each other for a few minutes and had a bit of a fight, and then Browning cranked on a hold that Miyake, well, I'm pretty sure Miyake let him put it on him. He might have been trying to squirm out of it, but once you let somebody put a full hold on, it's hard to get out of that. And that would be more in the lines of unprofessional behavior, lack of cooperation, or a fight. It was not a shoot because Browning wasn't trying to change the outcome. Miyake wasn't trying to change the outcome. But they did have some kind of disagreement in the match, and that's what this led to. And it's not a true, legitimate shoot in the way that we think of shoots today. Or I'm sorry, it would be if we think of shoots today. It's not the way a shoot was ever considered in the wrestling business before modern times. That was not a shoot. A shoot was a legitimate contest or a double cross. We will see some kind of similar things in other places at other times, but I wouldn't even consider this a full double cross because I don't know that Browning was intending to hurt him. I think Browning was trying to get his attention because of what he had done to Browning, and he unintentionally injured him and he couldn't continue. And it could have been his age had as much to do with that. I mean, he's in his mid-40s, and he's in his mid-40s in the 1920s, so It could very well be that that contributed to an injury he would not have normally gotten in the past. I'm going to do a review this week, but it's going to be a little bit different review. So if you were expecting a wrestling review, I'm actually going to talk about the UFC Fight Night, because it does kind of tie into wrestling in one bout, which I will cover in just a few minutes. But the UFC Fight Night was the first Fight Night card I've watched in about 4 months. I actually only got the ESPN Plus for this month to watch the English Football League playoffs. So the Championship, League 1 and League 2 playoffs will be in May. And I got the ESPN Plus subscription to watch the playoffs. So I've already seen Bolton and Barnsley, the first leg, and I've seen Oxford United and Peterborough United first leg match, but I'm still catching up, so don't tell me what happened until I get caught up. But I watched this card from the beginning to the end, and it's not only the first time I've watched a card from the beginning to the end in probably about a year, but I watched every fight on the card. And the card started off with Veronica Hardy versus J.J. Aldrich in a really close fight. Hardy won by a unanimous decision. And then we had St. Louis's own Charles Johnson, and he fought Jake Hadley in a really entertaining fight. And it was close in the first round, but in the second and third round, Charles Johnson really pulled away. And then what I would say was probably the least technical, but the most entertaining fight of the night. Well, I can't say it was most entertaining because I thought there were a couple fights that were better, but it was entertaining, and you're watching it saying, how can these guys stand up? There's no way this is going 15 minutes. And it went 15 minutes. And that was Trey Waters versus Billy Ray Goff in a welterweight fight. And I do not know how these guys withstood the punishment. They just threw bombs at each other the whole time. They were so tired, they looked like they were going to fall over, and they just keep coming back. It was an amazing show of endurance. Definitely not an amazing show of skill. And Trey Waters took a unanimous decision. One of the more controversial fights, Tabitha Ricci, who I really like, fought Tisha Pennington and won a split decision. That fight could have definitely gone either way. It wasn't a robbery, but that was a fight that either person would have won. You couldn't have really faulted it either way. And then a fight that lasted about all of 10 seconds. Esteban Rabovic knocked out Terrence McKinney. 37 seconds was the official time. And it was a beautiful head kick knockout. And he was out. Then Chase Hooper had a fantastic performance. I know this is a guy that the UFC thought that they really had something with, and then he kind of went on a bit of a losing streak, but now he's starting to put it together, and he looked outstanding in this fight with a very, very, very tough fighter in Vyacheslav Borshev. Now, the fight that I'm going to come back and talk about was next, when that is Waldo Cortez Acosta and Robelis de Spain, and we're going to come back and talk about them because Sean Woodson, another St. Louis fighter, fought Alex Caceres, and that was a very close fight. I think Woodson won the last 2 rounds. I think Caceres won the first one, and that was a super close fight, but Sean Woodson won again, and I think this guy could be a potential champion here in the future. Diego Ferreira surprised everybody when he beat Mateus Rebeski, and in the first round it looked like Rebeski was going to kill him, and then Ferreira came back and showed why those wily veterans are wily veterans. Carlos Oberg knocked out Alonzo Menefield, and that was over fast. Alonzo Menefield kind of ran at him, and he caught him. And then St. Louis's own, this was one of the better fights on the card. It was a pretty dominating performance from Buckley from rounds 2 on. And Joaquin Buckley won a unanimous decision Varuzaboyev, and that it was a well-deserved decision. I don't have much to say about the main event. Two big heavyweights that I wasn't all that interested in, and some bad game planning and not all that exciting. So let's go back to the fight that everybody was talking about after the card, and that was Waldo Cortez Acosta versus Rebelis de Spain. And Rebelis de Spain is I believe, an Olympic gold medalist in Taekwondo. If I had not known that he was a high-level Taekwondo fighter before, I would have known from about the first 10 seconds of the fight on, because I am a 4th degree black belt in Taekwondo, and he has the bad habit of what most Olympic fighters do, and they all fight with their hands at their waist, because there's no punches to the face in Olympic sparring in Taekwondo. So most Taekwondo sparrers are very confident they can get their hands up to keep from getting kicked in the face, and they all fight with their hands at their waist, which is something I've warned all my students. If you have to defend yourself and your hands are at your waist, you're going to get knocked out. That's not what happened here, and I'll give it to Despain. He has some tremendous punching power, but he has no grappling ability. At least he showed none in this fight. He got taken down, and he could not get up. And that was the story of the fight. Waldo Cortez Acosta just kept taking him down, and it wasn't that hard to take him down, and he showed no ability to get back up when he was taken down. What was controversial about this is Despain was a huge betting favorite, so anybody that bet on Cortez Acosta made a killing in gambling. And remember what I said about why they started working pro wrestling, why they fixed fights in boxing. A lot of times it's around gambling schemes. And with the popularity of sports betting today, people are very concerned. I mean, there's already been a federal investigation of one fight I know. And that's what's the authorities are going to be keeping an eye on this. And I know that the last thing UFC wants is for anybody to think any of their fights are predetermined. And they're not, but you're going to have to keep an eye on it, because if you get some disreputable trainers and fighters in there and they can bet on themselves, you never know what could happen. That's not what happened here. I know that particularly if you lost a lot of money betting on what you thought was a sure thing, that you will think, oh yeah, I got ripped off because this guy threw the fight. No, it was someone who is so confident in his skills, and I mean, his last two fights were less than a minute together, so he does have tremendous knockout power, but it's somebody who is very confident in their own skills, who has not learned the grappling and was completely helpless once they were taken down. He could not get back up, and that's why he lost the fight. So there's no collusion here. There was nothing to show that these guys were cooperating with each other in this fight. You just had somebody who hasn't learned one of the most basic things about mixed martial arts, because they're so confident on their one style that they can knock anybody out, that they don't practice that. And some of the announcers said it best. That's all he should have been practicing. He's got the striking down. He doesn't need to really work on that. I would send him to a boxing coach and teach him how to keep his hands up. But that didn't even seem to really bother. He got hit in the face a couple times. He just walked through it. But he had no ability to get back up when he got taken down. And unfortunately, that's why I drill my students in jiu-jitsu and other styles of grappling, is because if you are a Taekwondo striker and that's all you can do, you see what happens when a grappler gets a hold of that person. They get taken to the ground and they can't get back up, and they're pretty helpless. You have to know how to get back up. You have to know how to get out of those situations, because it's not being able to hit hard is not going to do you much good when you're laying on the ground. So this was not a gambling scheme, but they're wise to be keeping their eyes on that thing, on that aspect of MMA, because you do have to worry about that. It's why wrestling originally was worked, and it's also why they were fixing. I think that still goes on, but not but nobody takes a dive. If you want to fix a boxing match, fix the judges, and it's almost impossible to prove. When people take dives, some people can figure that out, but it's almost impossible to prove in a judgment call like that with judges. So that's how you fix it. Well, we've had another short episode, but unfortunately that's what we have when it's just me talking. We'll have the band back together, so I'm sure you're going to have a longer episode for the next episode. I hope that you did find this episode informative, though, and that you have a better understanding of why they started working. That was a question I had as a young wrestling fan. Well, not a young wrestling fan, as a teenage and a 20-year-old wrestling fan. How did working start anyway, and why would people willingly let someone beat them? Well, money. That's why people got into the sport in the first place, and it's why professional wrestling evolved the way it did. And when they put on exciting work matches, more people came out to see them. So, everybody take care. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye, everybody.